So I have to say, though, first that I'm excited to be here because you might have seen me running around during the lunch session because I saw mentors and people that I used to work with. And for me, this, like you said, this is my version of celebrities. And also I'm excited that I get to tell my coworkers that I followed M. Night Shyamalan, because that'll make me sound pretty impressive. So it sounds like there's different levels of interest and maybe even levels of knowledge on this subject. So I'm going to provide, I think, a framework that at least I've used through thinking through these things and when talking to other people. So there's three main things that I hope that people would take away from me and from the panel in general. One is that extreme weather is the new normal. Two, these events exacerbate the underlying socioeconomic challenges our communities already face. Yep. I think that one's important because a lot of people say that these events, such as hurricanes, are great equalizers because they don't discriminate. But the truth is that the discrimination happens beforehand, so it just exacerbates those events. And then third, that resilience is a more cost-effective strategy than recovery. So climate change is the new normal. I hope everyone saw that last week the government released the National Climate Assessment. It's actually a pretty remarkable report. I would urge people to check it out. You can go to globalchange.gov. It's pretty interactive, especially for a government report. It's beautiful. There's lots of imagery, and you can look by region to see what exactly your climate-fueled extreme weather events are more likely to happen in your region. But overall, the report states that not only are these events going to get worse, but they're already occurring. So we've seen heavy precipitation and floods, droughts, heat waves, and severe storms. This past decade, we've seen a 30% increase in presidentially declared disasters than the previous decade. So last year alone, there were 60 presidential declarations, 9 of which cost a minimum of $1 billion to address. There were 114 fatalities and a loss of $20 billion to 44 states. That was just last year. So in the last few years, there's over $200 billion that we've had to spend in addressing these events. So the second takeaway, that this is the new normal. According to the 2008-2012 American Community Survey, there are 12.4 million Americans that are living in highly distressed neighborhoods. So that's neighborhoods where there's about 40% of people living in poverty. So these are the kinds of communities that at least I've been thinking about through this. I think another important thing to note is not low-income people aren't the only people living in low-income neighborhoods. So there's a good study by Patrick Sharkey at NYU who talks about how the average African-American family that's making $100,000 lives in a more distressed neighborhood than a white family making about $30,000. So there's not only is there economic issues at hand, but there's still racial disparities that are basically revealing the multi-generational effects of concentrated poverty. And so because of the legacy of issues like redlining and that sort of thing, this is also a racial equity issue. So how exactly are low-income communities vulnerable? One of the biggest issues is housing. So in 1970, I know I wasn't around then, but there were about 6.2 million extremely low-income households and 6.5 million units of affordable housing available to them. Today, we have a shortage of over 5 million affordable housing units. As a result, you have, I know I'm throwing out a lot of numbers, but that's one of my skills is I can remember numbers, is that you have 7 million people in this country that live in mobile homes, and we know that during tornadoes, half of the victims tend to be mobile home residents. So what you're seeing is that people with the affordable housing crisis, low-income people and minorities are living in neighborhoods that are at greatest risk because they're most affordable. So these houses can't withstand the high winds or precipitation. A good example, I won't go too much into Sandy because I know the other speakers will talk a bit about this, but the public housing in Sandy were in the storm surge areas. About half the victims in the low-lying storm surge areas were low-income families. And they found that weeks after the storm, there were low-income residents still stuck in their high-rise public housing apartments because of elevator outages. So if you're an elderly person, you're not going to be able to go down the 20 flights of stairs in order to escape. So the fact that the boilers and the electricity, all of the infrastructure of the building was below the flood levels was a huge problem. This also goes to another way that low-income communities are vulnerable, is environmental hazards. So one of the most, I guess, startling statistics or examples of this that I like to point out is think about the New Orleans Superdome. Now, the ExxonMobil refinery in Baton Rouge is 250 times the size of the New Orleans Superdome, and 75% of the people that live around it are African Americans. And so when you have these extreme weather events, we've seen over the past few years that because there's not really much teeth in some of our regulations that we have against refineries, that they're not necessarily shutting down operations during storms, and you get basically a toxic brew of chemicals afterwards that's seeping into water and communities. So low-income people, minorities disproportionately live near landfills, waste facilities, these sorts of things that put them at risk with these events. One of the other things that I think we forget to talk about in this conversation is the heat island effect. So we often talk about these big storms because they're very dramatic and scary events, but one of the greatest threats, environmental threats to our lives are heat waves. So every year, hundreds of people die because of heat waves. And low-income communities are more likely to have fewer trees. And this is called the heat island effect because you have much more asphalt. During the daytime, you can see the temperature rise a few degrees within an inner city compared to the suburbs or rural areas. And at night, that temperature difference could be 22 degrees higher. And low-income families, only 1 in 5 have air conditioners or can afford the electricity to run them. And it's huge because air conditioning reduces your chance of death by heat by about 80%. This is another environmental hazard that we have to think about, is just not having enough trees in the area. One last vulnerability that I'll kind of skim through, even though it's the huge one, is in economic insecurity. So I think that comes up a lot more in the recovery process. But a couple things that I will say is that low-income families are less likely to have insurance, so it makes them more risky when there's flooding. And the other thing I'll say related to recovery, though, is that low-income people often lose their food, whether it's because their refrigerator, the power goes out and the refrigerator goes out and the food spoils. But luckily, communities get access to disaster SNAP. So it's the disaster version of food stamps to replenish the food they have. However, when a lot of people are displaced, they are moved to communities that might not actually accept the EBT cards that have their food stamps on them. So after Superstorm Sandy, a lot of people were moved to different communities, and they basically had food stamps that they could not use. So the resilience part of that is just making sure that our communities have grocery stores, that we don't have people in food deserts so that they're dependent on specific grocery stores where they can use their benefits. And that kind of leads me into what can be done about these vulnerabilities? What does it mean to have resilience? One of the things that Jeremy and I were speaking about before this session started is that basically if you just address the issues related to poverty, that's probably one of the biggest things that you can do. So having better affordable housing, making sure that it's not low-income people and minorities who are living near environmental hazards, this makes communities so much stronger. So if you're already doing basic community development work, you're part of the way there. But it's about also, I think, inserting some additional protocols into that work. So if you're looking at doing a new affordable housing site and it happens to be near some low or at sea level, maybe you make sure that your boilers are above where the flood lines historically have reached, those sorts of things. One of the things that I have personally found through my research to be critical is social infrastructure. So the people that I refer to being trapped in their public housing after Superstorm Sandy, they were not helped by FEMA officials. They ended up being assisted by a group called Occupy Sandy. And evidence shows that having a strong civic infrastructure really reduces a lot of the risks that low-income communities face. So in the report that I wrote on CAP's website, it's called A Disaster in the Making. One of the recommendations that I had is to make sure that affordable housing and public housing organizations or units are working closely with community-based organizations. I think the great example I have of this is that in 1995, there was a huge heat wave where over 700 people died in Chicago. And you had a low-income African-American neighborhood that saw a lot of fatalities, as you might expect. However, there was another African-American low-income community that fared better off than some of the wealthier neighborhoods. So there was a big study that was done to see why is it that this neighborhood fared particularly well. What they saw was that they had community block clubs. They had a lot of churchgoers. They had just enough infrastructure, restaurants, and things to do that people knew one another, so they could go check on the elderly woman that they hadn't seen out and about at that time. So I think working with community-based organizations in the planning process, I think, is one of the most critical things. I think we can probably, as the conversation develops, talk about a little bit more of the technical fixes, like stormwater runoff and those sorts of things, using green stormwater and making sure that we're protecting our wetlands. But I actually think that it really bears underscoring that some of these social infrastructures are important. And the last thing I'll just say about that is that I think Raj Chetty was here yesterday talking, and his research has also shown that when you have that robust social infrastructure, it increases social mobility. So that's why I think that you get a double benefit from this, is that not only are you more resilient, but you're also ensuring that people are escaping poverty.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Neill.
Yeah. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Let me start with Rockefeller Foundation's definition of resilience, because people tend to have slightly different definitions of the term. For us, it's the ability of individuals, communities, businesses, cities, systems, to survive, adapt, and thrive in the face of acute shocks or chronic stresses. And cities, of course, have always been on the front lines of dealing with shocks, floods, landslides, fires, acts of terror, sudden infrastructure collapse, pandemics. And low-income communities are often those that are hit the hardest, whether it's the 9th Ward of New Orleans or the residents of public housing in New York that Tracey was talking about. Similarly, cities have, throughout the ages, confronted chronic stresses: unemployment, poverty, crime. But three things really make the shocks and stresses of today particularly acute. The first is globalization. The second is the immense scale of urbanization throughout the world. And the third is climate change. And these three trends together are making the need for a more resilient approach ever more vital, especially in cities. Before diving in, let me make an important distinction. Resilience is not just urban renewal with new bells and whistles. And urban renewal, of course, is a loaded term, so maybe I should say urban revival or urban development. But there's still a difference. While urban development helps transform a city to operate at its highest levels on a good day, urban resilience ensures that the city can continue to operate even on its worst day. But it's not just about keeping the bad things out. resilience building can also be a lever for unlocking greater economic development and business investment, as well as improved social services and more broadly shared prosperity. That is what we at the Rockefeller Foundation are calling the resilience dividend. And key to the resilience dividend are tools that can deliver both greater resilience and greater opportunity. The resilience dividend really has two components, and I'll talk a little bit about each. First, it refers to the difference between how a disruptive shock or stress to a city, the impact that that will have on a city that has made resilience investments compared to where the city would be if they have not invested in resilience. And second, it describes the co-benefits that investing in resilience can yield to the city. Job creation, economic opportunity, social cohesion, and equity. So let me take those two features in turn. First, on making the investments that decrease the impact of a shock and thereby reduce the costs of that shock, both financial and social. That's really the goal behind 100 Resilient Cities, the $100 million urban resilience commitment that Rockefeller announced last year on our centennial. The driving ambition behind 100 Resilient Cities is to help cities globally, including here in the U.S., increase their resilience to shocks and stresses, and to leverage public finances and the resources of the private sector to help them do so. We opened the challenge last August and received nearly 400 applications from around the world. In December, we announced the first group of 33 cities, 10 in the U.S., ranging from New York, Norfolk, Jacksonville on the East Coast, New Orleans, Boulder, Colorado, El Paso, Texas, and there's a group in the Bay Area with San Francisco, Oakland, and Berkeley. By 2015, all 100 cities across the globe will be chosen, and they'll receive 4 types of support. First, funding to hire and empower a Chief Resilience Officer for the city, or a CRO, a central point of contact within each city to coordinate, oversee, and prioritize resilience activities. Second, support for the Chief Resilience Officer to lead stakeholders in the development of a resilience strategy. And we've just started that process with a series of what we're calling agenda workshops in each of the cities. Third, cities in the network will have access to a platform of services that is designed to help them leverage resources well beyond the $100 million that we're putting in. And this is designed to help them support the development of the resilience strategy, including solutions that integrate big data analytics, technology, resilience land use planning, infrastructure design, and new financing and insurance products. Our partners so far on the platform include Swiss Re, Palantir, the World Bank, the American Institute of Architects, Sandia National Laboratories, and we'll be announcing more over the coming months. And fourth, cities will be members of the 100 Resilient Cities Network, which will provide support to the member cities, share new knowledge and resilience best practices, and foster new connections and partnerships. By having a Chief Resilience Officer to develop a strategy, by being able to learn and share with other cities, and by being able to access new sources of financing and technology, we think cities will be able to make the investments that can help them better withstand and bounce back from a shock, thereby realizing the resilience dividend. So let me now talk about the second part of the resilience dividend, the co-benefits that investing in resilience can yield to a city: job creation, economic opportunity, social cohesion, equity. An example here, which might be of interest to Anne-Marie, who asked about transportation, is bus rapid transit, where we at Rockefeller have been working in New York, Philadelphia, here we are in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and some other cities in the U.S. Because we see it as fostering both resilience, but also having an economic and equity play. Bus rapid transit, or BRT, is a high-performance transit option that combines the permanence, speed, and reliability of rail with the flexibility of buses at a fraction of the cost of a subway system. In terms of the resilience play, let me talk a little bit about New York. In the immediate aftermath of Superstorm Sandy, when the subway tunnels under the East River were flooded, Brooklynites boarded buses at Atlantic Terminal in Brooklyn and crossed the East River bridges using exclusive lanes. They probably didn't know it at the time, but what they were using was a dressed-down form of bus rapid transit. BRT has two main benefits as an addition and, in some cases, a resilient alternative to a subway system. For one, buses aren't physically bound to predetermined routes like train tracks. That means in emergencies, these buses can be mobilized quickly and safely to evacuate people in flood zones or other emergency situations. And second, it allows for the expansion of the city's transportation options at a much lower cost than, say, the Second Avenue subway, which has taken billions of dollars and 80 years to build. But as well as the resilience benefits of BRT, we see it as an important equity play. It's not just about moving people around in emergencies, it's also about ensuring that they can get to their jobs and their schools no matter where they live in the city, on storm day, but also every day. More than 750,000 New Yorkers commute more than an hour each way to work, and 2/3 are going to jobs that earn less than $35,000 a year. Communities facing unreliable service, long wait times, and overcrowding really require, and I think deserve, more than just an upgrade of the current bus system. So BRT would bring high-speed service to entire corridors, connecting more isolated communities in the boroughs outside Manhattan to opportunities in terms of education and jobs in Manhattan and the rest of the city. Finally, resilience isn't just about infrastructure investments like BRT. As we've been mentioning earlier, it has a strong social and community component as well. Realizing the resilience dividend and doing so in a way that truly benefits low-income residents requires community engagement. And community engagement's been a key part of the success of Rebuild by Design, which is a multi-stage design competition to develop innovative, implementable proposals to promote resilience in the region impacted by Sandy. From 148 international applicants, 10 interdisciplinary teams were selected to participate in the competition. Those teams were required to consult with the neighborhoods they were designing for, so it's not a top-down solution. And this was a real engagement process, evidenced by the fact that Rebuild by Design interacted with representatives from 535 organizations and held 49 community meetings, an average of more than 4 per team. Rockefeller Foundation provided $3 million to help run the competition, and that investment will leverage the expenditure of potentially billions in community development block grant disaster recovery money, the Sandy aid money from HUD, and allowing that money to be spent in a more resilient way. That, for us, is a smart use of philanthropic dollars. And we hope that through efforts like 100 Resilient Cities, Bus Rapid Transit, and Rebuild by Design, we can help cities smartly make their investments in a way that can help them better prepare to deal with emergencies, but also to benefit low-income communities and thereby enable the whole population to realize the resilience dividend. Thank you.
Okay, Jeremy.
All right.
You are last but not least, and I guess we'll have to have Neill back after and ask him if there's how you get chosen as a resilient city.
I can
Because it
answer
sounds like
that.
there's another round coming.
Yep.
So there's an opportunity.
So forgive me, I'm doing a very 1990s thing. I have some paper.
Here, I'll hand it out.
All right.
Yes. And you have to jiggle that, he said?
I'm gonna
to
jiggle
no
it.
longer green.
Oh, I'm going to jiggle. Where's the presentation?
Up top, you're going to go to the slideshow.
Just click on your name.
Oh my God.
Oh, he
Wow. Groovy. Going to slideshow? Huh, I'm loving it.
I don't have enough for everyone.
Now,
so-
now you do.
Wow.
There you go.
All right. Hi, I'm Jeremey Newberg. It's nice to see everyone. So, what I'm going to share with you in our time together is how to go about a resiliency plan on a community level. And I come to you as someone who used to live in San Francisco after the Loma Prieta earthquake, where the Bay Bridge, a portion of the Bay Bridge collapsed. I was on that bridge heading to the World Series game.
You can just keep talking. I'm sorry, I'm jiggly.
Cool. And I was working for a nonprofit called Neighborhood Housing Services America, and I became a community organizer in West Oakland. And West Oakland was divided by a double-decker highway. That highway collapsed. A lot of people died. It was devastating. And true to what you said, when they built that highway, it basically cut off a vibrant, predominantly African-American, lower and middle-class community, and it suffered. And I was, I think, 25, and with some FEMA money, given a staff of 4, formerly unemployed local folks, and we went door to door knocking on homeowners' doors saying, have you applied for your FEMA benefits? And typically what happened was with the earthquake, the house got off the foundation, the porch separated, the chimney fell. There were issues. We couldn't get people to sign up. Why do you think we couldn't get people to sign up for FEMA benefits? They were predominantly lower income, and they thought if they signed up for the FEMA benefits, it would threaten their public assistance. There was so much misinformation. Through that, I actually worked on a plan to move that highway. And it was an absolute act of audacity to think that you could move an interstate highway. Well, we found that there was a rail yard that ran along the line of the bay, and that we could move that highway over and reunite that neighborhood. It took 10 years, and it worked. And it was astounding. There I was with a big, blown-up land use map, and these were the days where you put acetate over, and then we literally used dry erase tape to show where to put it. Well, that was enough through a series of community meetings to get it on the agenda. From there, I went to work in politics, and I went to work doing community organizing, and I was trained in the Cesar Chavez farm workers model of community organizing, and I helped get a single mother with an associate's degree elected to Congress in Silicon Valley. And in Silicon Valley, they shake your hand and say, what did you get your PhD in? Anna Eshoo, an amazing, amazing congresswoman. I'm sharing this with you because it's a journey, and I've realized, it's like, how did I end up in disaster recovery? Well, it started in San Francisco, but it's also that experience in community organizing. And some people approach community organizing from a justice perspective, which is very important. I approach it from a community building perspective, moving a message, building a coalition of support. And I want you to keep that theme of community organizing and resiliency planning front and center, because your second point on the 3 maladies that a disaster exacerbates existing community problems is huge. Because the flip side of it is the communities that know how to communicate, organize, and mobilize do better in preventing a storm to have devastating impacts and or managing the impacts of the disaster. So there's a unifying theme that's running along here. Now, this permutation of Jeremey Newberg and capital access and disaster recovery actually started a year ago, because for the past 4 years, we've been an expert in a financial disaster recovery. Now we're in storm disaster recovery. Financial disaster recovery was addressed through the Neighborhood Stabilization Program with HUD, a wonderful $7 billion program that was profoundly effective in terms of acquisition of blighted, foreclosed, or abandoned properties where the options were demolition, repair, or new construction, and it gave communities incredible resources to do a lot of good. I only wish Congress approved NSP 4, because that was moving towards economic development in the reuse of the properties that were stabilized. So we're experts in the Community Development Block Grant Program, which is the primary source of recovery money. One thing to keep in mind with a disaster, there's relief, there's recovery. What's the difference? What's the difference between relief? What's the difference between recovery? Sustainability for the longer term on the recovery side? Mm-hmm. Which is harder, relief or recovery? Way. So, it's relatively, I mean, it's a mess, but there are firms that do very well that can manage debris removal, that can clear a road and get it stabilized for it to function, that can get the water out of the New York subway system to get it back up and running, that can get people who are stuck in those high-rises or get the fuel in Long Island to get those distribution channels going. That's all relief. Usually a single mission with a single source of funding. Okay? Recovery is a much more complicated enterprise because you're dealing with the nature of the community and you're also dealing with money that have many, many more rules. So when you see these complaints about how New York City and New Jersey are doing a miserable job with Sandy recovery, well, it's 8 years since Katrina and they're still working through stuff. It's just a different approach. Now, if you don't plan, others will plan for you. Not necessarily with your own best interests in mind. So what I want to do is spend some time with you going over the components of a resiliency plan from the perspective of someone who works in recovery, disaster recovery, of what we've seen to help better prepare your community. And I think what you'll see is that this basic outline will resonate not just for storm resiliency strategies, but general improved quality of life and prosperity. So, if low-income communities do not plan ahead of the storm, other forces, get that double entendre? Did you get that? I thought that was clever. May plan for them, sometimes on their own terms. Now, resilience. The actual definition of resilience is bouncing back. And Judith Rodin, I think, coined the term of the Rockefeller Foundation, maybe the vision is to bounce forward. I dig that. I hope you do too. So my point is, when you're doing a resiliency plan, dare to dream. Dare to have vision of what you want your community to be like. Because if it's a low-income community, chances are there are deficits that you want to see addressed. So messaging matters in resiliency planning. And so the vision is bouncing forward, not necessarily bouncing backward. So generally, I like to frame the objectives in 3 categories. Preserve the safety of people, property, and community assets. Position people, property, and community assets to withstand a storm and return to functionality with minimal disruption and cost. This is in total alignment with where you were going. Pursue opportunities to engage residents in planning and execution of the relief response and recovery rebuilding. Oh, dearie dear. Well, here's where it gets interesting. Oh, geez, I can't employ local people. You know, we need specialists. I have to bring in my crew from Louisiana, you know, because they have a special way of using the sweeper and opening the bags for the debris. It's a farce. It's a farce. When we did $223 million with the Neighborhood Stabilization Program for the state of Michigan, we embedded in our developer contracts that if you don't hit a local hiring number of 20% and report it with each draw for funding, we won't pay you. You have to embed the local hiring in your contracts. Okay? It won't happen any other way. You know, FTD florist Merlin Olson says, say it with flowers. Jeremey Newberg says, say it with money. Okay? So local hiring only works unless it is explicitly embedded in the contracts and enforced not at the end, but at each draw. Okay? Now, your challenge on a community level is to make sure your workforce is ready. That's the other side of the equation that sometimes gets missed. And I was delighted, Bonnie, to hear that the Fed is focusing on workforce development. It is huge. Sadly, I don't know if this is happening, but I'm getting a lot of emails. 5 minutes? I'm just getting warmed up. Is it really 5 minutes? You serious? Yeah. Oh, man. Guess I'll have to come back. Wow. I'm having a moment. Okay. Where was I?
Make sure your workforce is ready.
Please. Because there are economic opportunities in the recovery. Now, the first piece of your workforce is actually volunteer and coordination. And again, your plan for resiliency isn't perfection, it's the pursuit of the good, because the storms are just so chaotic and you don't quite know how they're going to hit. Generally, your components of the plan are how you serve people, your neighbors, the young, the able, the elderly, and people with special needs. Have you done an assessment of everyone who is dependent on a ventilator? Have you done an assessment of everyone who has a mechanical wheelchair? Do you have a plan for how they get to safety? Infrastructure, that's a harder play, and typically most counties and cities should have some type of emergency disaster plan, and you need to look at what those are as it relates to infrastructure to make sure your critical infrastructure is included in that plan. Okay? All right? No, it was a deep thought. It was a deep thought. Housing serves homeowners and renters. Businesses, your constituency with businesses are business owners but also workers. Big issue, how do workers get to work after the storm? Another issue with businesses, what role can the business play in the disaster recovery in terms of just basic service? And I felt the whole issue with fuel access was astounding with Sandy because that was just a supply chain issue. That was emblematic of bad coordination, and I think they've addressed a lot of that. As much as that was the problem with generators to work the pumps. And then quality of life. What's your community? What's its identity that you want to preserve? Now, typical plan, just like any other plan, what's your target area? Where? Who do you seek to serve? What are the components? When and how do you deploy, and with what resources? For low-income community, under-resourced communities, your greatest assets are your ability to communicate and organize, your knowledge of the community and where and how to direct assistance, your time and your energy. Now, what saddened me working on Sandy recovery, particularly in one of our neighboring states, was that there was not a view that the nonprofit community organizations were viable partners in the disaster recovery. If anything, it was adversarial. Now, if there was a plan, that mindset might have been changed. And with Mayor de Blasio, because here's what happens. In the rush to serve people fast, the grantee is either a state government, a city, or a county. And they're going to get tens of millions or hundreds of millions, or in Sandy's case, $1 billion or 3 or 4. And they've got to get that money out the door as fast as possible because people are suffering. So they're going to choose scale. And if your coalition of community groups can't show that you can scale, you will be looked over. But if you have a plan that you've sold to your elected officials, then you've changed the terms of the engagement. All right, so I have to skip through this because I have 1 minute. Now, just one thing, you've got to identify who is frail and vulnerable and how best to get them to safety. Backup generators are huge, particularly with people on ventilators. Handing out pre-storm evacuation checklists are huge. Waterproofing legal documents, oh my God. Or just getting people to scan their documents and, saving them to the cloud. This can do so much to get them through the system. Because in working with the 14,000 applicants of the New York City Build It Back program, our single biggest problem is a terrible data system. But our second biggest problem is the exhaustion of the applicants in assembling the critical documents to do eligibility. And so getting people to waterproof or save their documents is huge, taking pictures of their properties. Trimming trees is probably the best resiliency strategy I know, because when you trim trees, they don't fall on power lines. And I've got to skip through all this, okay? But this is my big point for you. Approaching resilience is like being a community organizer. You want to identify needs and services to be provided. You want to assign roles and functions to your neighbors. Who's your resiliency block captain? Who's your broker of information? Okay? If those high-rises had been organized, there might have been a different result. That was just a national tragedy. We so can do better than that. We so can do better than that. Basic organizing. I'm not getting funky on eco-groovy design with you. Okay? Basic community organizing. Now, communicate and organize to be prepared for assistance if it comes, but be ready to solve problems on your own if assistance does not come in the manner that you need. You might be flooded with water bottles and meals ready to eat, but does that meet what you need? Your ability to have a plan will help you as you get flooded with people who want to help. And so your plan has to include, when that comes in, how to properly direct it. I had to use Bruce here because we take care of our own is a big theme, because no one can help you better than yourself. And the more that we can teach that in a low-income community, well, really any community, the better off we are. And finally, because I aspire to be a Jedi warrior, don't underestimate the force. While the forces of a storm present the power to do damage, it also presents opportunities to organize and improve a community. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. Okay, I have been to 2 different sessions where the moderator says, I'm now going to use moderator's privilege, I'm going to ask 3 questions, and they say, thank you so much, time to go. So I'm not using moderator's privilege, but I do have questions. If you don't ask them, I'm jumping in. We really have a tremendous information base. The data on what's happening in local communities is just, it's up to date, it's extensive, and Tracey is here. Jeremey is literally in the trenches in 2 states dealing with this, and giving an opportunity to look back and say, what should we have done differently so that we wouldn't have all these issues after Superstorm Sandy is tremendous. And Neill has teased us to let us know that there is more funding available for resilient cities. And they really spent a lot of time looking globally at what cities need. So what are your questions? And it's such a small group. If you can hear each other, you don't have to stand up and go to the mic. If people can't hear, then I'm going to ask you to do that. Go, Tony. This red group sitting all the way in the back.
You can get us going, Karen.
Okay. So, I'm starting with you, Neill, because you have this idea of a chief resilience officer. It intrigues me, but I really can't picture the day-to-day duties. Okay, so it would be wonderful. So Cleveland now gets a grant. They have a chief resilience officer. What are they doing?
Sure. I think the Chief Resilience Officer so far has actually been the aspect of the 100 Resilient Cities challenge that has excited the most interest and the most questions. So let me give you a real-world example. San Francisco, they, about a month or so ago, appointed their first Chief Resilience Officer as part of the effort, a chap called Patrick Ottolini. and he was formerly working as their point person on earthquakes. So that makes sense in San Francisco, right? He's an earthquake expert. But we want to make sure, and this is very much part of his focus, that he will be covering more than just seismic preparations. And he really gets and understands the need to look at not just the potential shocks, but also the stresses, and how, as we've been hearing today, they really interrelate with each other. The vision for the Chief Resilience Officer is someone who can be at a high level of government, either reporting to the mayor or a deputy mayor, but certainly someone who has access to the mayor and the city leadership. They should be someone who can develop with us the resilience strategy. So I mentioned that that's the second part of what cities get as being part of the network. So really working with a cross-section of organizations and groups, knocking heads within city government and across departments, but also engaging the private sector, NGOs, academic institutions, and other major players in the city to develop that plan. Then they're going to be the point person for the third point, the third area of support that we're giving the cities, the access to the platform. So once they've developed their plan, identified their needs, we're putting together this platform with a variety of services. Not every city is going to need every service, but the idea is that we can help them match the city with the services that they need. The Chief Resilience Officer is going to be the point person in the city who we're going to be working with to help deliver those services. And then the fourth part, the fourth benefit that I described, the learning, shared learning in the network, again, this is where the Chief Resilience Officer will be the point person with the other Chief Resilience Officers around the world to be able to share learning and knowledge. Some about shocks that they might have in common. You know, San Francisco and Christchurch, which is also in there, can talk about earthquakes. But maybe there's also something that San Francisco can learn from Bangkok and their experience with flooding that might be relevant. And finally, I know you sort of teed up earlier, sort of how do you apply, what's next? So I'll just answer that question as well. We deliberately decided to do this in 3 rounds so that we could really focus on providing the support that the cities need, and also so that we can learn as we go along. So the first round was selected in December of last year. We'll be opening another round in June with cities selected in December, and then we'll do a third and final round, or likely final round, in 2015. So we'll have all the information up on the Rockefeller Foundation website some point in June. We don't have an exact date yet.
And can I just ask, is there a size requirement or anything to be an eligible city? Can Allentown and Cleveland and any city qualify?
So we may make some adjustments to the requirements, so don't take this as gospel, but last year it was any community over 50,000 in population.
Okay, people. Yes.
Do you have any examples of cities that had a disaster response plan in place so that when disaster struck, the impacts to vulnerable populations were minimized or mitigated? The Katrinas and the Sandys, we hear about it.
I mean, really, look at the Netherlands. I mean, they understand that those are cities below sea level, and over multi-decades they've been embarking on plans to do that. And shame on us for New Orleans, because it's a similar topographical and geotechnical dynamic, but that's the inequity of poverty. No, people aren't going to like what I'm about to say, but that happens all the time. I am a huge advocate in a situation with what happened in Katrina, where you are so in harm's way that the recovery plan needs to be get you out, but get you out with dignity and get you out with an opportunity to still be near your neighbors if at all possible. Tall order. We're a finalist for the New York State buyout program to help 2,000 people in high-risk flood zones take a voluntary buyout, and they get an incentive if they move within the county. You know, a lot of people move to Houston from New Orleans. And the idea is, no, you got to leave this area, but we still want you in the broader community. And we've got to detoxify, take the toxicity out of the dialogue, because it's not eminent domain, it's we don't want you to get hurt. So I would look to the Netherlands and the communities that understand from a topography and geotechnical perspective their risk. All the 100-year floodplain is now obsolete. Okay? All the flood maps on the coast are being redrawn. It is actually a political issue, sadly, because it's impacting flood insurance. But just follow the flood maps. And if, you know, we want to talk about employment, the growth industry is resiliency plans. Okay? So if you have a 20-something who can't find a job, start a resiliency planning firm.
So I would say, I might have a selection bias because clearly in my research I'm looking for what people are doing wrong so that we don't do that again. And it probably would have been good to invest a lot of time in looking at what people did right. But I think in doing a lot of research, I've found examples of people doing a lot of right things after the fact. So I'm sure that there are good examples out there. I think some of them have been by accident. So like the examples I discussed about Occupy Sandy or the 1995 Chicago heat wave, where just having the infrastructure in place allowed people to avoid some made more disastrous results. So I think people are learning from these past experiences and having these aha moments where, well, that worked and that was an ad hoc operation. How can we make that into a more concerted effort? Some good examples of what people are doing. I think Hoboken is working on putting or building redundancy into their electricity grid so that if part of it goes out, there's backup grid. Philadelphia, where we are, I think if anyone was in the sustainability session earlier, talked about their green stormwater. So they're making sure that, because in urban areas there's a lot of flooding, so putting in a lot more green space to basically serve as sponges. A lot more cities are doing that, but also because the EPA is kind of requiring that, since there's a lot of violations of the Clean Water Act throughout the stormwater runoff. So I would say at least most of the best practices I have identified have now been because of learning from past mistakes or unintentionally good work.
Just a couple of examples. One is in India, where last year when they were hit by the heavy typhoons, they had an evacuation plan in place that they successfully evacuated hundreds of thousands of people, and compared to storms that had taken a similar track a few years previously, the loss of life was significantly different. And closer to home, the bad flooding last year in Colorado, Boulder came through a lot better than some of the neighboring communities because they had invested in a lot of flood protection, kind of drainage facilities that also operate as cycle paths, so you're getting that sort of double return that I was talking about in my remarks. But I think, to pick up on Tracey's point, the common theme there, and which we see over and over again, is these are things that communities have done in response to a previous catastrophic event, and how do we get to a place where we can actually motivate communities and leadership to take action before they have a catastrophic storm or other earthquake or other type of event.
That's great. So we have a couple questions. I just want to make clear that when Neill said that they also served, it was as cycle paths or bike paths. At first I heard psychopaths. Right here, they have this flooding, psychopaths, I don't know.
zombies in the flood drains. Yes.
So I'm Miriam, actually I'm the editor of Shelter Force, and I wanted to ask, particularly Jeremey, though you guys could jump in too. I was interested, you're talking about the community organizing aspect, and I wondered if there are places where there is a combination of disaster preparedness and resiliency planning going on along with advocacy to get rid of a threat that is man-made. So for example, I'm in Albany, New York, and we're trying to fight these explosive crude oil trains that are coming through town. The Bakken crude from North Dakota that exploded and killed 47 people in Quebec. And so we need a plan because they're coming through and it's a potential disaster. We also want to stop them from coming, and increase various sorts of, so there's a political aspect. But I wonder if you know of any place that is joining those two kinds of things in the same process.
HUD assigned us last fall to work with New York State because they wanted to create a resiliency retrofit fund. And we were like, well, that sounds cool. What does it mean? And it became a David and Goliath exercise because the utilities had one frame of reference and just weren't that accessible. But I had a watershed experience interviewing the United Way of Long Island. And what they were asking for was retrofitting their center so that it could be a place where people could congregate, where they could develop services with backup generators. They still hadn't figured out what they wanted to do with elevation because a lot of the technology with resiliency is to let the storm come in and then let the water come in and let the water leave. But that means elevating, raising mechanicals, and it's, what's the term, wet proofing?
Or living with water is...
There you go, living with water.
There's probably a more technical term for it, but that's the philosophy,
it'll come to me, but it's the whole thought process around elevation. Let it come in, let it go out. The other thing that they wanted were enhanced communications because they were prepared to identify and catalog special needs people who, if the power goes out, they're going to die because they're dependent on machinery to breathe or function. So it's a very small example of understanding a need, organizing and mobilizing to address that. That's a plan that should get funded. What you're talking about as it relates to an environmental risk that exists today that is a natural and an unnatural disaster waiting to happen. So you're asking for my advice on how to go about that?
If you know of any place that's combining that sort of political organizing with resiliency planning.
Well, the interesting thing is fascinating because with the Community Development Block Grant, HUD is so successful in scaring the daylights out of grantees if they don't follow environmental review. And you would think environmental review is this fossil of a cross-cutting federal regulation, but it stops people in their tracks. Because if environmental review is not followed, the local grantee will be forced to pay back the money. Now, the problem with a railway is it may or may not have used public funds. But what we've seen with public funds is as old and as much of a blunt instrument as environmental review is, it pauses and stops the process to at least get people to gather, what are we doing here?
Yes, Jerry. Hi. After 60 years in philanthropy, but I'm no longer in philanthropy, except for indirectly, I was interested in the role of philanthropy and getting money after disasters. That seems to be a huge issue. If you look at New Jersey and how money is not exactly been effectively deployed, and also in terms of community organizing, if we lift it up as an important element
jump in first?
So, I mean, I think from our perspective, we are really looking to see how we can use our funds to hopefully leverage others to come in with more, or others to spend their money more smartly and in a more resilient way. So the example I gave of Rebuild by Design, that's where we feel by making an investment of $3 million to run the competition and the challenge, which surfaced all these creative ideas, teams from all around the world wanted to be involved. The $3 million was to provide stipends for the teams, but most of them put in far more into it than was the equivalent of the stipend, because they were really excited by this process and what the potential was. And then working with HUD on that, the Sandy recovery money, we hope will then be able to be spent in a more resilient way. So our $3 million investment in that competition is going to leverage the smarter use of billions of dollars in federal recovery money. So I think that's one model of leverage. The 100 Resilient Cities is another model whereby we're obviously making a substantial investment, but what we are also doing is sort of using what we see as really our convening power and our brand to bring private sector actors and NGOs who are interested in this space and have something to offer to the table, bring them onto this platform that we're creating. We then connect the cities with those services. So we're not paying for those services, but we are bringing the private sector partners in particular in terms of the financial resources, that's obviously they have that to offer, into a dialogue with the cities and really acting as a connector. So that's another role that I think philanthropy can play.
And I actually wanted to address that as well. I used to manage a working group of about 15 funders from different foundations that worked on sustainability issues. And in having a conversation with one recently, they will remain nameless, but I think that sometimes, and I think that I'm really excited about what Rockefeller is doing, and I think they have the right approach. I think, unfortunately, some funders, this might not be the right word, but there might be an arrogance in terms of the approach. So that one funder I was talking to recently was very interested in environmental issues and assumed that a lot of community-based organizations that are addressing poverty don't know anything about the environment or don't really care about the environment, when I think in actuality a lot of organizations focused on low-income communities, they might just use different words. Rather than talking about climate change, they might talk about asthma rates or all these other things that are environmental issues that are impacting low-income communities. So I think that sometimes, I think this goes to something we were talking about beforehand, sometimes funders might be interested in the big projects that are flashy, like we want solar panels when really a house might just need weather stripping. So I think what would be important is if some of the environmental funders are talking in-house with their more community development funders, because this woman I was speaking with recently was astounded that I sit on, at CAP, I sit on our poverty team. So all the work that I do, I enter from a poverty lens, but I work very closely with our energy and environment team. And she was like, you guys work together? I'm like, well, that's the best way to do it. So I think that the way that Rockefeller's approach is serving as a connector and facilitating these relationships is the best way to do it. And I don't know if there's other funders in here or people who have relationships, but I think that making sure that we're crossing these boundaries and not making assumptions about what people's environmental knowledge is critical.
So the role of philanthropy, I was astounded in New Jersey because HUD sent me to do needs assessment to inform their action plan. And as soon as we got there, they said, no, we know what we're going to do. In New Jersey. No, it was the state. And I was like, oh, dearie dear. And what happens so there's $16 billion in Sandy Community Development Block Grant out of the $60 billion appropriation. There's $16 billion. It's been released in 3 tranches. They're just about to release the second tranche. The first tranche was basically 1.7 to 1.6 billion between New Jersey, New York State, and New York City. Each tranche you have to do an action plan of how you divide up the money. The categories are typically a little bit of planning, a lot of housing, small business, economic development, infrastructure, and some community services. The housing gets broken up into rental, homeowner services, and public housing. HUD leaned on New Jersey hugely to address public housing. New York City, just by the nature of the housing stock, was focused on it from the very beginning. Not as much money went into infrastructure in the first round because people wanted to help people with their housing and businesses. Both in New Jersey and New York, they completely underwrote and overstructured the small business assistance. We're going to underwrite. We're going to do credit analysis. It's a disaster. Of course their credit is shot. The question is, did they have a pulse? Did they have a pulse? Did they show with prior performance that it was a viable business? And so what I'm trying to share with you is there was a gap of where people are. And what's happened, I'll get you. What's happened in the second tranche is a shift from business assistance, because they couldn't get the money out the door, to infrastructure. And so the exciting investments in resiliency for infrastructure are going to happen in the second and third tranche. And it takes a long time for the lead up. But this Sandy recovery is 10 years that we're looking at. The role of philanthropy could be to fund community planning processes, community organizing, and then once a plan is in place, fund the implementation. One of the key components of the implementation is to train elected officials, agency executives, corporate labor and community leaders in what is in the plan. Governor Christie called Governor Bobby Jindal for advice. We literally had people coming in I saw people coming in from Louisiana, and some of them were very smart and had great insight. I'm not discrediting it, but there are a lot of smart people in Jersey too. And so a disaster is an equal opportunity scourge, and they're painful, and you're unprepared. I'm not assigning blame, but with each disaster we learn more. And if philanthropy is looking for a role, that prep work will be an incredibly productive investment. All right, you had, Miss?
We had a question here and then.
Well, my question sort of has to do with what you were talking about, and it just from an outsider looking in, it seems to me that some of the most critical issues surrounding disaster relief and recovery have to do with who's in charge. And it seems to me that if we're going to continue to face these disasters on increasingly large scale, that there has to be some kind of plan about who's in charge and whose decisions take precedence. And I'm not sure. My question to you is maybe who will make that plan? Does somebody like Rockefeller Foundation lead that? Who has enough? I mean, it involves state and federal and local government, and who has authority. Could you talk just a little bit about that?
I can start, yeah. I mean, I think we hope that the Chief Resilience Officer can play a role in that. Obviously, we're funding that position in just a few cities at the moment. But, our hope is we're funding it for 2 years in the cities that are part of the network. We hope that in those 2 years, the value of that role and planning will be a key part of it, is proven in a way that, A, the cities where we funded it keep it after our funding is over because they see how important it is, and B, other cities which are not part of the network see that they need to have a CRO themselves, and maybe through other philanthropies or their own internal funding are able to create to create that position. So I think we would certainly see a role where we can play in as we are in helping to fund. I don't think it would be our role to actually make that plan. I think that has to come from, in this case, the city, but doing so in a way that we're certainly encouraging the chief resilience officers to do, where they're consulting widely and bringing in a good array of stakeholders. And we specifically have in the application and the grant funding that we're given that there needs to be a focus on poor and low-income communities in that planning and an engagement of them in the process.
So I would say it has to, I agree with, but I'd say it has to be a multi-stakeholder effort, which is a pretty tall order if anyone's ever tried to do anything that's multi-stakeholder. I think that the city obviously has to have a huge stake in it because that's where you're going to be directing resources towards what your priorities are. Just from past experiences, and I haven't worked on resilience work on the ground the way that Jeremy's working, but in terms of doing large-scale community development efforts, what we did when we were giving large sums of money, I worked at an organization called Living Cities, would give large sums of money to someone that was going to be on the ground and could be that convener. And we thought, well, if we give the money to the city, the government, sometimes people have political issues with the government. So we tried to figure out who could be a neutral party that could serve this organizing role. For us, we ended up working with community-based foundations because usually people like local funders because they're not in the government and they give you money. So we were like, that's a good role. So we worked closely with, whether it's the Cleveland Foundation, the San Francisco Foundation, and they were able to staff these coalitions. I feel like there would need to be some sort of model like that. I'd be interested, in Jeremy's thoughts, but I think that this issue, I think there needs to be someone that's thinking about it all the time, like a chief resiliency officer, but I think also resiliency has to be built into everyone's work, that it can't be an asterisk, because there's going to be ongoing projects that cities are working on. So if your city is doing some sort of transportation project already, that whoever's heading that should be thinking about how can this be more resilient. So I think it has to involve everyone because there's a lot of money that's being spent already, and that would be a lost opportunity.
Levy, since we only have 2 minutes left, I have one last question I promised to take. Harold?
I didn't get to answer.
Maybe you can integrate it into...
Yeah, well, I'm going to say that you said something, Jeremy, and I didn't want us to go too quickly past that. Ironically, just a moment after Miriam talked about the possibility of a derailment in Albany, she got a note there was a derailment in Albany.
Oh, no explosion.
No,
But it wasn't reported on time. They're being fined.
So, I agree totally. You need resiliency officers, you need collaboration, you need all that stuff. But public policies are changed in 3 ways. You can wait for the policymakers to do the right thing on their own, so make sure you pack your lunch. Or you can influence them with lots of money, and that might be by lobbyists, lawyers, trips to the Bahamas, whatever. Or you can influence them with bodies, with people. And every single thing the Christie administration has done right, they did unwillingly and only after advocates really forced them. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but I don't think so. I think it's an understatement. So, Jeremy, you said community organizing, that list of things, but really didn't elaborate. I think that in terms of the role of philanthropy, I know Rock and lots of other foundations do support the engagement, civic engagement, organizing. I think without having that component before, during, and after, the best intentions are not going to do the right thing.
Okay, so Jeremy, you get the last word. You've got to give it in 2 minutes.
Okay. So there are three types of money in a disaster. The first is the big community development block grant, disaster recovery. The relief money is FEMA. Okay? There's philanthropy. And then there's the market. Okay? Now, with CDBGDR, I'm still not convinced HUD is the best agency to deliver this money. Because I'm almost 25 years in the business, and I'm increasingly realizing that subsidy flows more effectively when it flows directly to a human being rather than a piece of real estate. It's just become too complicated. A resiliency plan can help you prioritize what you need to do first, second, and third. And what I've found is when plans are done well and with a communications professional here properly marketed in the best sense of marketing, they will take hold. And that impacts the leadership decision. Chris Christie wasn't prepared to manage a disaster, nor was his staff. Mayor Bloomberg was out the door, even though he embraces resiliency. Governor Cuomo, former HUD secretary, was ready. And you're going to see two things with Governor Cuomo. He's going to push the boundaries of the HUD regs. It drives the HUD staff crazy. The second thing is he's established a network through the counties to prioritize the infrastructure investment money. So it is moving into the local level. But each of those three states have their own communities, have their own personalities, their own topography, their own market. And, you know, they just weren't ready. So the question to the leadership is, when it's federal money, it's going to go to either a governor or a county executive or a mayor. You can't change that. What you can change is how you educate and train them and their staff.
That has to be the last word. Thank you so very much. You were great. Please fill out the evaluation